I was folding laundry in my tiny apartment when my phone started buzzing across the kitchen counter. I almost let it go to voicemail. Only three kinds of people call me these days: telemarketers, wrong numbers, and my mother when she needs something. That day it was my mother. Olivia, you have to come home. Before Christmas. Please. I froze. I had not heard that pleading tone since I was a teenager, begging her to believe me instead of my sister. Back then her voice had been firm, dismissive, soaked in favoritism. Now it sounded thin, worn down. I put the call on speaker and stared at the faded magnet from my childhood stuck to the fridge, a silly little drawing I made for my grandmother. The word revenge had been circling in the back of my mind for months. Not the violent kind, the quiet kind, the payback that comes from finally telling the truth. Why would I come home, I asked. Last time I checked, I was excluded from everything that mattered to this family. The funeral, the will, the inheritance, the wedding, all of it. On the other end, my father cleared his throat, that old controlling habit of his sneaking into the conversation. This is not the time to sit in resentment, Liv. The family business is in trouble. Your grandmother's will is being questioned. There may be legal consequences. For all of us. That was the part they did not know. I was the one who had hired the lawyer. I was the one who had walked into that courthouse with the original will my grandmother signed before she died. I was the reason a judge had started asking questions about why my name was missing from the version my parents submitted. Come home, my mother whispered. We need you. Your sister needs you. The family needs to stand together. I tilted my head, savoring the bitter taste of their sudden fear. For years, I had begged them to see the injustice, the manipulation, the way they turned our home into a stage for constant family drama and betrayal. Now, days before Christmas, the tables were finally turning. I will come, I said slowly. But we are going to talk about everything you hid: the will, the inheritance, grandmother, the way you treated me at the wedding, all of it. There was a long, shaky silence. Fine, my father said at last. We will talk. He had no idea that this time I would be the one controlling the script. And I was done playing the forgotten daughter in my own life. When people hear the word favoritism, they think of small things. The bigger slice of cake, the nicer Christmas gift. Maybe the older sibling gets the car first. In my house, favoritism was a full-time job. My sister Grace, 3 years younger, was the chosen one. The golden child. My mother called her our little star, and the future of the family business. She was the one who would inherit the real estate company, the lake house, the mansion where my grandmother used to live, every last corner of the family empire. Me, I was the responsible one, the boring one, the one they assumed would survive with or without support. I was the background character in my own family drama. I still remember a Thanksgiving dinner when I was in college. I had driven all night to get home because I had an exam the next morning. I walked into the kitchen at dawn, bleary-eyed, hoping for coffee and maybe a hug. My mother did not even look up from the pie crust she was rolling out. You are late, she said. Grace has been up for an hour helping me. Grace appeared in the doorway, hair-curled, cheeks glowing, already wearing a dress. She gave me that pitying smile she had perfected over the years. Hi, Liv, she said softly. You look tired. Are you still doing that little internship? The one with the legal aid office? It was not a little internship. It was the first time I had ever seen a judge in person, the first time I understood how justice worked outside of television. The first time I realized that revenge could also mean letting the truth walk into a courtroom. At dinner, my father raised a glass and toasted to our future CEO, Grace. My relatives clapped. My grandmother, sitting at the end of the table, caught my eye and frowned just a little. There was sympathy there, a quiet apology. When nobody was looking, she reached under the table and squeezed my hand. You are stronger than you think, Olivia, she whispered. Do not let this family convince you otherwise. That moment burned into my memory like a stubborn flame. Years later at her funeral, I would not even be allowed to stand beside her casket. They made sure of that, and that was when real revenge stopped being a fantasy and started to feel like a promise I owed myself. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. She was not soft or gentle in the way people expect a grandmother to be. She ran her household like a quiet general with rules and expectations, but also with a strange sense of fairness. She had seen too much betrayal in her own life to tolerate it in others. When I was a child, she would take me on walks through the neighborhood near her mansion, pointing out which houses she had helped buy and sell back when she worked at the very beginning of what became our family business. "Do not let them fool you, Olivia," she would say. "This company started with my sweat, not your father's swagger. I know what I built, and I know who deserves to inherit it." I used to think she loved me and Grace equally, but as I got older, I noticed something strange. When we visited, my grandmother always asked me to stay behind after everyone else went home. She would make tea, sit me down, and ask real questions. "Are you happy in school? Do they listen to you at home? Do you feel respected?" Sometimes when Grace and I fought, and my parents blamed me out of habit, my grandmother would call later that night. "I heard what happened," she would say. "I do not believe you are the only one at fault." Those calls made me feel seen, like there was at least one adult who could smell the injustice rotting under the polished surface of our family. One summer afternoon, I found her in her study sorting through stacks of papers. The room smelled like old books and lemon furniture polish. She looked up as I hovered in the doorway. "Come in, Liv," she said. "I want to show you something." She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope with my name handwritten on the front. "This is for you," she said. "If anything happens to me and you feel that something is wrong with the way they handle my affairs, I want you to take this to a lawyer you trust." I stared at her, the word lawyer echoing in my head. "What is it?" "Proof," she said simply, "of what I really wanted, in case people try to rewrite history after I am gone." I laughed nervously, trying to make light of it. "You mean like a secret will? This sounds like one of those inheritance stories from the internet with revenge and hidden truths and family drama and all that." My grandmother did not laugh. "Sometimes those stories are not just stories," she said. "Sometimes they are warnings." I slipped the envelope into my bag. At the time, I thought it was just another example of my grandmother being dramatic. But after her death, that envelope would become my weapon, and my parents would never see it coming. When my grandmother died, I found out from a neighbor. Not from my parents, not from my sister. I was in the middle of drafting a contract at the small law firm where I worked as an assistant. My supervisor had left me alone in the office and the phone rang. It was Mrs. Anderson, the woman who lived across the street from my grandmother's mansion. "Olivia, dear, I am so sorry," she said. "I saw the ambulance this morning. Has anyone called you?" My heart dropped. I called my mother right away. She let it ring so long I was sure she would not answer. Finally, she picked up. "Yes? Mom, what is happening? I just heard about Grandma. Is she gone?" There was a pause, then a small sigh. "Yes, she passed during the night." A rush of grief hit me, followed by a hot wave of anger. "Why did no one call me?" "We were busy," she said sharply. "There were doctors, the coroner, the funeral home. Your father has been dealing with the lawyer. Besides, you live far. Grace is here. She is handling things." That sentence said everything. Grace is here. You are not. You are optional. Excluded. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and drove straight to my grandmother's mansion. When I pulled up, there were already cars in the driveway, relatives wandering in and out carrying boxes. I stepped onto the porch and my father blocked the doorway. "This is not a good time, Liv," he said. I stared at him, stunned. My grandmother died. I am her granddaughter. I belong here. The house is a mess. The lawyer is coming. We are trying to get everything organized. We do not need more emotion right now. More emotion. That was how he described my grief. "Let me see her," I begged. "Just once, please." He looked over his shoulder and then tightened his jaw. "The body has already been taken," he said. "We will let you know about the funeral." He never did. I found out the date from a cousin's social media post. When I called to ask where to go, my mother told me the church was full, that it would be too complicated to change the seating chart, that it would be better if I remembered my grandmother in my own way. That was the day something inside me cracked. The injustice was no longer subtle. It was not about Christmas gifts or forgotten birthdays. This was cruelty dressed up as logistics. I went home, opened my closet, and dug out the envelope my grandmother had given me. I sat on the floor and tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in her careful handwriting, along with a signed document that looked unmistakably like a will. My name was there clear as day, not as a footnote, as a main heir. She had left me a share of the family business, a share of the mansion, a share of everything my parents later claimed was meant only for Grace. In that moment, grief and rage braided together into something sharp and cold. If my parents wanted to rewrite my grandmother's wishes, they were about to discover that they were not the only ones who could hire a lawyer. If the funeral exclusion was a slap, the wedding was a public shove off a cliff. Grace announced her engagement a few months after our grandmother's death. My parents threw a huge engagement party at the mansion, parading her around like a princess who had finally found her prince. He was a charming man from another real estate family, the perfect match for their ambitions. I was not invited to the engagement party. That news came through the family rumor mill, not through a polite phone call. When I confronted my mother, she sighed as if I were being dramatic. It was a small gathering, she said, mostly business partners. We did not want to make things awkward. Awkward? That was their favorite word for cutting me out. But when it came to the actual wedding, they decided they had to invite me. Not because I was family, but because appearances mattered. A missing sister in the wedding photos would raise questions among the business crowd. I received the invitation in the mail addressed coldly to Ms. Olivia Parker, no +1, no handwritten note. The venue was an expensive country club outside the city, the kind of place where the carpet is thick and the staff learn your name in 2 minutes. I almost did not go. But by then I had already met with a lawyer. I had already learned that the will my parents had filed with the court was different from the one my grandmother had signed. In their version, my name was missing. The mansion was listed as going entirely to Grace, and the business shares were consolidated under my father, with a vague plan to eventually pass them to Grace. My lawyer told me there were questions about timing, about signatures, about how the documents had been handled. It smells like manipulation, she said bluntly. You have a strong case, but it is going to get ugly. Ugly I could handle. I grew up in ugly. So I packed my anger into a simple navy dress, pulled my shoulders back, and walked into that wedding like it was a stage. From the moment I arrived, I felt the tension. Some relatives greeted me warmly, surprised to see me. Others refused to meet my eyes. My parents pretended everything was normal, introducing me as our older daughter Olivia. She keeps busy with her little job in the city. Little job, little life. During the reception, they seated me at a table far from the main family table, tucked between distant cousins and a vendor's wife. When the speeches began, my father took the microphone and delivered a heartfelt monologue about Grace, about how she had always been devoted to the family business, about how proud my grandmother would have been to see her today. He did not mention me once. When the music started, I slipped outside to catch my breath. That was when I overheard them. My mother, my father, and Grace standing near the hedge, talking in low voices that sharpened with every word. We did what had to be done, my father said. If Olivia ever finds out about the will, we will deal with it. For now, everything is in your name and your mother's name. The company will be safe. Grace sounded nervous. What if she hires a lawyer? She works around lawyers, remember? My mother dismissed it with a wave of her hand. She does paperwork in some office. She is not going to start a war over something she was never meant to have. Besides, we have the signed will on file. The judge will see it our way. She will look ungrateful if she causes trouble after this lovely wedding. I stood there in the shadows, heart pounding, hearing them confirm every suspicion I had kept buried. They had rewritten my grandmother's will. They had excluded me on purpose, and they were counting on my silence. That night, while the bride and groom danced under fairy lights, and people toasted to love and family, I made a quiet promise to myself. I was done playing nice. A week after the wedding, I sat in a small office across from a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. Her name was Rachel, and she specialized in messy inheritance cases, the kind of family drama most people would rather pretend does not exist. I laid everything out on the table. The original will my grandmother had given me, the version my parents filed, the letter Eleanor wrote explaining her true intentions, the story of the funeral, the overheard conversation at the wedding. Rachel listened without interrupting, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk when I mentioned the funeral exclusion and the way they had kept me away from the house. This is not just favoritism, she said finally. This is a pattern of exclusion. And if they altered or hid a legal document, that is more than bad behavior. That is something a judge will take seriously. Hearing that word judge made my stomach twist, a mix of fear and relief. Do I have a real shot, I asked, or am I just chasing revenge because my feelings are hurt? She leaned forward. There is nothing wrong with wanting justice and payback when you have been wronged. But what you are describing is more than hurt feelings. It is about inheritance, a will, a family business, and a pattern of manipulation. You have evidence. You have a signed document, and a timeline that does not add up. If we move carefully. But yes, you have a shot. We filed a petition to challenge the will. We requested the documents from the court, the logs from the lawyer who had helped my parents, the communication records showing when and how the final version was created. The more information came in, the more the story shifted from a vague suspicion to a clear picture of betrayal. My parents had visited their lawyer shortly after my grandmother's hospitalization. The original will had been updated years ago to include both granddaughters and outline specific shares of the company and the mansion for each of us. But the final version filed after her death looked different. My name was gone. Certain clauses about the business had been rewritten. Rachel used words like possible undue influence and potential fraud. I used simpler words in my head: lies, betrayal, greed. At night, lying awake in my small apartment, I thought about my grandmother's voice. If anything feels wrong, take this to a lawyer you trust. I had done exactly that. And with every passing week, it became more obvious that my parents' perfect narrative was cracking. Still, there was a cost. Lawsuits do not happen in a vacuum. The rest of the family started whispering. Some called to tell me I was brave. Others accused me of tearing the family apart, of being jealous of punishing my parents for choosing Grace as the face of the business. One aunt said, "Why are you doing this right before Christmas season? Can you not wait?" I realized then that some people care more about the timing of discomfort than the truth that causes it. Revenge. I was learning is not just about winning. It is about finally refusing to apologize for wanting fairness. The day the judge agreed to open a formal inquiry into the will, everything shifted. Rachel called me first thing in the morning. "The court has questions," she said. "They want to see the original documents. They want to hear from you and from your parents. This is not a guarantee you will win, but it means the questions we raised are serious enough to deserve real answers." Within hours, my mother was on the phone. "How could you do this to us?" she cried. "You filed something in court. Your father and I were blindsided. The lawyer called us in a panic. Do you want your father to have a heart attack?" For years, guilt had been my leash. The fear of being the difficult daughter, the one who made scenes, the one who upset the family. This time I felt strangely calm. "I did what Grandma asked me to do," I said. "She gave me her real will. She told me to go to a lawyer if anything felt wrong. You made sure I could not say goodbye at her funeral. You sat outside a wedding and talked about hiding the truth. This is not about my feelings. This is about what you did." She tried a different angle. "You will ruin Christmas," she said. "Your sister is planning her first holiday as a wife. The family business is under strain. Why would you want to add a legal battle on top of that?" "Because you started this," I replied, "when you erased my name." My father called later, voice clipped, all warmth replaced by cold authority. "You have made a serious mistake, Olivia," he said. "You think the court will take your side because you are hurt. But documents speak louder than feelings. Our lawyer handled everything legally. You will embarrass yourself." I thought of the envelope my grandmother had given me, the way her handwriting curled around my name. "We will see what the documents say," I answered, "all of them." That was when the real tables turned. The family who used to decide where I sat at dinner, whether I was invited to Thanksgiving, whether I could stand by my grandmother's grave, now had to explain themselves to someone who did not care about their holiday decorations or their social image, a judge. And that was only the beginning. Which brings me back to the phone call that started all this. By the time my parents called asking me to come home before Christmas, the situation had changed. Their lawyer was nervous. The judge had ordered a closer look at the signing dates and the circumstances under which the final will had been drafted. There was talk of calling witnesses, of questioning the staff at the mansion, of asking the old family lawyer why my grandmother's original instructions had been altered. My parents were used to controlling the story. Now the story was slipping out of their hands. When I pulled into the driveway of the mansion that December afternoon, the house looked smaller. Or maybe I had just grown enough to see past the shine. Inside, the decorations were perfect. A tall Christmas tree near the front window, garlands on the staircase, soft music playing. Everything looked like a holiday commercial for the perfect family. My mother stood in the foyer, twisting a dish towel in her hands. My father lingered behind her, arms crossed. Grace sat on the couch, her new husband beside her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother rushed forward and tried to hug me. I stepped back. "We are not going to start with a fake hug," I said quietly. "You did not want me at the funeral. You tried to erase me from the will. You made jokes about my little job while you rewrote my life over cocktails. Let us not pretend we are just another happy Christmas family. We are here because a judge is watching and you are scared." Her face crumpled. "You do not understand the pressure we were under," she said. "Your grandmother was stubborn. She wanted to split everything. Your father and I had to protect the business. If we had divided the company, there would have been chaos." "Chaos for you," I replied. "Not for me. I never asked for control. I asked for fairness. I asked to be treated like more than a spare part in my own family. You did not just adjust numbers, you erased my name." Grace stood up suddenly. "Can everyone please calm down?" she said. "This has gotten out of hand. Liv, you know they never meant to hurt you. They just made a decision. They thought I was better suited to lead the family business. You have your own path." I stared at her. "Do you know what was in the original will, Grace?" "The one Grandma gave me." Her eyes flickered. "She left shares of the company to both of us," I continued. "She left the mansion to be divided, not for you to own alone. She asked for us to share responsibility, not for you to be crowned queen while I am treated like an intruder. This was never about whether you are capable. It was about whether I am disposable." Silence settled over the room like dust. My father finally spoke. "What do you want?" "Olivia," he asked, "if we settle this quietly, what will make you happy?" "Money, a share of the company, a token part of the inheritance." Something in me hardened. "I want the truth on record," I said. "I want the court to see what Grandma intended. I want you to admit in front of a judge, if necessary, that you changed things to benefit yourselves and your favorite daughter. And I want the law, not your guilt tricks, to decide what I deserve." My mother shook her head as if this were some petty argument about presents under the Christmas tree. "You would drag your own parents into court." I took a slow breath. "You dragged me out of my grandmother's funeral. You dragged me out of the family photos. You dragged my name out of her will. This is me standing up, not dragging anyone anywhere." My words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. For the first time in my life, I watched my parents realize that I was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter they could push aside. The courtroom was not glamorous. No high ceilings or dramatic lighting. Just beige walls, wooden benches, and a judge who looked like she had heard every possible story of family betrayal and inheritance drama. My parents sat at one table with their lawyer. Grace sat between them, cheeks pale, hands folded in her lap. I sat at the other table with Rachel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The judge started by asking simple questions. Dates. Names. How long had the family business existed? When had Eleanor written her first will? When had the updated version been drafted? Then the real questions began. Rachel presented the original will my grandmother had given me along with the letter explaining her intentions. She laid out the timeline, the hospitalization, the visits my parents made to their lawyer, the suddenly updated document, the disappearance of my name from the inheritance, the consolidation of power into my father's hands. She called a nurse who had taken care of my grandmother during those last weeks. The nurse testified that Eleanor had been lucid most of the time, but became upset when conversations about money and property came up, insisting she had already arranged everything. The old family lawyer, a man who had retired and moved to another state, appeared by video call. He testified that Eleanor had been clear about wanting both granddaughters included, that she had expressed concern about favoritism, that she did not want any one person controlling everything. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled at first. But as I described the funeral exclusion, the way I found out through a neighbor, the way I had been told the church was full, something inside me steadied. This was not just a legal oversight, I told the judge. It was a pattern. I was always the one left out. The forgotten birthday, the missed Thanksgiving invite, the Christmas card that arrived late or not at all. The inheritance was just the biggest and most final version of what they had been doing my whole life. My grandmother saw it. That is why she gave me her will directly. She trusted me to stand up for her wishes. My parents' lawyer tried to paint a different picture. He talked about how my father had sacrificed to build the company, how Grace had been involved in the business from a young age, how I had chosen a different path, how updating a will was normal. But the judge kept returning to one issue. Why was the original will not produced at the time of probate, she asked. Why did only the later version appear, and why were certain clauses changed substantially? My father stumbled through his answers, blaming confusion, paperwork, the stress of grief. My mother kept dabbing her eyes, insisting they only wanted what was best for the family. At one point, the judge looked directly at my parents and said, "Even if your intentions were to protect the business, you had an ethical obligation to respect the wishes of the deceased. If Eleanor wanted both granddaughters included, you were not free to remove one simply because you preferred the other." That single statement felt like a wave washing over years of gaslighting. For so long, I had been made to feel dramatic, unreasonable, jealous. Hearing someone with authority call it what it was felt like oxygen after years underwater. This was not just a family squabble. This was injustice. And finally, it had a witness. The judge did not issue a decision that day. Court decisions move slowly, and real life does not always deliver quick cinematic endings. But the process itself had consequences. Word got out in the community. Business partners started asking questions. Rumors of will disputes and hidden documents do not sit well with investors or clients, especially in a company that sells trust and security, along with houses and office buildings. Some longtime employees began to look at my parents differently. One older agent, a woman who had been loyal to the company for decades, pulled me aside one afternoon. "I heard what you are doing," she said quietly. "Your grandmother always spoke highly of you. She told me once that you understood justice better than anyone in the family. I think she would be proud of you right now." Meanwhile, Grace's perfect image began to crack. Her husband's family, who had been delighted to merge their business interests with ours, started to hesitate. Nobody wants to tie their future to a company whose founders might be dragged through court for inheritance manipulation. At home, the Christmas season was no longer a parade of matching pajamas and staged photos in front of the tree. There were closed doors, hushed arguments, emergency meetings with lawyers, tense phone calls. For once, I was not the one causing the drama. The drama was theirs. The consequences were theirs. I did not have to scream. I did not have to throw plates or send angry messages in the middle of the night. All I had to do was let the truth stand on its own feet. That is the thing about karma. It is not always mystical. Sometimes it is just the slow accumulation of every lie, every act of manipulation, every time you chose control over fairness. Eventually, those choices add up to a weight you cannot carry anymore. My parents were starting to feel that weight. One evening, after another long meeting with lawyers, my father called me. His voice sounded older, more fragile. "Whatever happens with the judge, he said you have made sure this family will never be the same." I thought about the little girl at the Thanksgiving table, the one whose hand my grandmother had squeezed under the table. "That is exactly the point," I answered. When the judge finally issued her decision, it came in the form of a written order. No dramatic courtroom speech, no gavel pounding the air, just pages of reasoning and conclusions. Rachel called me into her office, handed me a copy, and let me read in silence. The judge found that the circumstances around the later version of the will were questionable, and that my parents had exerted significant influence during a period when my grandmother was vulnerable. She noted the discrepancy between the original and final documents, the disappearance of my name, the consolidation of assets, and the testimony of witnesses who confirmed Eleanor's desire to treat both granddaughters more equally. The result was not a perfect fairy tale victory, but it was real. The court reinstated key parts of the original will. I was granted a share of the family business. The mansion once meant to belong solely to Grace was now to be divided or sold, with proceeds split according to the plan my grandmother had outlined. There were conditions, timelines, opportunities for negotiated arrangements. But the core truth was clear. My parents had tried to rewrite my grandmother's intentions, and the law had stepped in to correct the betrayal. Rachel looked at me and smiled gently. "Congratulations," she said. "This is as close to full vindication as these cases get." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "It does not fix everything," I whispered. "It never does," she replied. "But it shifts the balance. You forced them to face the truth. And you honored your grandmother's trust in you." At home that night, I sat at my tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea and read the order again. Words like fairness, undue influence, and reinstatement felt strangely human in this context, like someone had finally translated my years of pain into a language the world respected. My parents did not call that day. Grace sent a short message. "I hope you are happy," she wrote. "You just tore the family apart for a few shares and some property." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "This was never just about money," I wrote back. It was about not letting you all erase me. It was about honoring the only person in this family who saw me. It was about ending a pattern of betrayal that started long before either of us were old enough to sign anything. I did not hear back from her, but I did not need to. For the first time in my life, I was not waiting for their approval. I had my own reflection, my own sense of justice, my own voice, and I was finally using it. A few weeks later, I drove past the mansion one last time. There would be negotiations, appraisals, endless practical details about how to divide or sell the property. The family business would have to adjust to a new structure. There would be hurt feelings, angry holidays, and awkward future encounters. But this drive was not about logistics. It was about closure. I parked across the street, remembering the first time my grandmother had handed me that envelope. The way her eyes had held mine. The way she had trusted me with the truth because she knew others might not honor it. "Thank you," I whispered, "for believing in me when they did not." In the months that followed, I used my share of the inheritance to step away from the shadow of the family company. I went back to school, focusing on work that dealt with fairness and injustice. I volunteered at organizations that helped people navigate housing disputes and messy family conflicts. I saw versions of my own story reflected back at me again and again. Parents who favored one child and discarded another. Siblings torn apart by hidden wills and secret accounts. Spouses who manipulated documents to control everything after a partner's death. Revenge, I realized, is not always about making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. Sometimes it is about refusing to carry their dysfunction forward. It is about saying, "The injustice stops with me." I still think about my parents, about Grace, about the business that consumed their lives. I imagine the Christmas dinners, now quieter, tenser shadows of the perfect image they once projected. But I also think about women like you, listening to this, maybe nodding along, because you have felt that same sting of being the excluded one. The forgotten daughter, the invisible sister, the loyal wife who never got the thanks she deserved. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is this. Your pain is not imaginary just because other people refuse to see it. Your desire for justice is not petty. Wanting fairness is not the same as being greedy. Sometimes the bravest form of payback is to step out of the toxic family circle, let the law or the truth do its work, and rebuild your life on your own terms. So if you have ever been cut out, overlooked, or told to be grateful for scraps, while someone else takes the feast, know this: you are not alone. And if you have listened all the way to the end, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your own stories of betrayal, revenge, and tables turning. Tell me what part of this hit closest to home. Because when we speak these secrets out loud, they lose some of their power. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is finally telling the story the way it really happened.